Hey there everyone, and welcome back for more human physiology. So in this chapter we are going to not talk about everything that you're going to find in this chapter because as we'll see on the next slide here, if you look at the chapter objectives, a lot of this chapter is, as you would expect, devoted to the anatomy of bone and the skeletal system. So being this is a physiology class, we're not going to worry too much about naming all the bones, listing all the articulations and the joints and everything like that. We want to just focus on bone physiology. So since chapter 6 for us is coming at the tail end of us talking about the endocrine system, the hormones involved in the reproductive system, the main thing that we kind of want to focus on here is just the basic physiology, and then we'll spend some time talking about some of the hormones that actually affect the bone and calcium homeostasis. We talked about those a little bit in chapter 17, but we're going to kind of round out that discussion here. So if you're following along in the Anatomy and Physiology OpenStax book, we are going to skip all of section 6.2 and then only very select parts of 6.3. So if something looks like just anatomy to you, you can probably ignore it. Okay, so you're probably aware of the mechanical functions of bone in providing a framework for which our body can kind of wrap around and all of our organs and vital tissues can be protected. But let's talk about some of the less obvious, more non-mechanical functions of bone. So, like I said, in addition to providing support for the body and providing the mechanical basis upon which we are able to move our body through the concomitant contraction of skeletal muscle, we want to kind of focus on some non-mechanical functions of bone and physiology. So first, we can talk about the bone acting as a mineral reservoir. So as far as minerals, we're really talking about calcium, which you would expect, and then also phosphorus. So both of these minerals are deposited within bone throughout the body, and then we can actually tap into the bone in order to release those minerals into the blood in cases in which those mineral concentrations get low. So this is a homeostasis mechanism. When we have a sufficient amount of these minerals, we can deposit them within bone, and then when the levels get low, we can extract them out of bone. So a little bit more on that later. Number two, we can use bone as a minor form of energy storage. So if you look within this bone sample here at this kind of ooey gooey center here, you can see yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow contains adipose cells which store up fat, as we discussed in chapter 4. So the bone cells, which as we're going to find out are very, very, very energy dependent, they can tap into that supply of fat when they need energy. And then finally, and arguably one of the most important functions, is hematopoiesis, the process of making new blood cells. So this process, as we will discuss in this chapter and later in the semester when we actually start talking about the blood and the cardiovascular system, the red bone marrow contains stem cells called hematopoietic stem cells. When these stem cells divide and differentiate, they can form basically any type of blood cell that you can imagine: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So something that we had discussed back in chapter 4 is that bone is a highly vascularized tissue, meaning it has access to a rich blood supply. So you might want to just stop for a second and make sure that you understand the significance of a tissue having access to a rich blood supply. Why would it need a lot of blood all the time? So you might want to think about that in terms of energy production and what sorts of things are in the blood that are related to energy production for the cells that receive that blood supply. As we discussed, the medullary cavity of long bones, as you see here, contain the yellow bone marrow that they can tap into for energy. The red marrow, its location will depend on what type of bone that you're talking about, but if you're talking about the long bone, like you're seeing in this diagram here, it's going to be located within the spongy or cancellous regions of the epiphysis. So you can kind of see it located up here at the top. And then the other place that you'll find red bone marrow is within flat bones, like the sternum, the ribs, the pelvis, etc. So the ends of long bones and within flat bones is where you will find red bone marrow. So where the diaphysis meets the epiphysis, which is also called the metaphysis, This is going to mark the position of something that you've probably heard of called the growth plate or epiphyseal plate. So you can actually see what's called the epiphyseal line here, which is also known as the growth plate line. So the idea here is that the epiphyseal plate relates to the growth of bone as a human develops over time. So what the epiphyseal plate actually is, it's actually not bone, but it's actually a thin layer of hyaline cartilage. And we'll talk about cartilage a little bit later. But essentially what this cartilage does is, in a growing and developing human, and other mammals as well, this layer of cartilage will expand over time, and as it expands, it progressively becomes ossified or turned to bone over time. So this explains how long bones like this can grow and cause a child to become taller as that child goes into adolescence and adulthood. But once you do reach adulthood, this epiphyseal plate closes off and becomes the epiphyseal line, which you see in this diagram. So that would tell us that the bone that we're looking at in this diagram is that of an adult. Otherwise, it would not be labeled as such. It would be labeled as the epiphyseal plate. Okay, so just a little bit of very basic anatomy of bone. Don't want to spend too much time on this because you've probably gotten plenty of this in your human anatomy class. There are several different layers to the bones. So the first to talk about is called the periosteum, which is really just kind of the outer sheath of fibrous membrane that surrounds the bone. And it's also going to be where you see a lot of the blood and lymph vessels penetrating and servicing the cells of the ossified bone matrix within. So the endosteum is the membrane on the inner surface of the medullary cavity, so you would have to look a little bit further within, so right in here. So that is going to represent the location of bone growth and remodeling when we have a more complete discussion on that a little bit later. But the main thing that we want to focus on for this particular video is the different types of cells that you find within bone. So if you'll recall back to chapter 4, bone is a type of connective tissue, and the one kind of distinguishing characteristic that we pointed out about connective tissue is that connective tissue doesn't contain a big density of cells. It's actually mostly extracellular matrix. You're going to find a lot more acellular material than you will cellular material. So the collagen that is within the extracellular matrix of bone is essentially providing a meshwork or matrix in which different minerals like calcium and phosphorus, which together we call hydroxyapatite, magnesium, fluoride, and sulfate, all these different minerals, it provides a matrix in which these minerals can crystallize and provide a nice solid support network for the entire bone there. But as a connective tissue, you will find some cells here, just not a whole lot of them. So there are 4 major types of cells you're going to be find suspended within the ossified matrix. These are called osteocytes, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteogenic stem cells. So let's talk about what each one of those does. The 2 main ones that we're going to want to talk about are the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. So osteoblasts and osteoclasts have antagonistic or opposing functions. One does one thing, the other does the exact opposite, and they're basically butting heads all the time. The osteoblasts promote the formation of bone and the mineralization of bone. So when osteoblasts are functioning, they promote an increased density of bone, they synthesize collagen, they promote mineralization and deposition of calcium and phosphate and other minerals. So the downside is that when osteoblasts do that, they actually themselves become trapped within the new ossified matrix, at which case they are no longer considered osteoblasts, they are now osteocytes trapped within, and they're not really going to be able to function the same way. So osteoclasts do the opposite. They, instead of promoting bone formation, they actually break down and resorb pre-existing bone in order to release contained within minerals like calcium and phosphate into the blood for the purpose of homeostasis. And then osteogenic stem cells are basically just the stem cells that will differentiate into osteoblasts to replace the ones that have been trapped within the meshwork and have become osteocytes. So the thing that I really want you to understand about this competition between osteoblasts and osteoclasts, like we said, they have antagonistic functions. So if you look at this funny little picture here, the osteoblast is, when it is functional, it is going to build the bone up. It's going to basically build a big wall of bony matrix and mineralization, while the osteoclast, when it maintains its normal function, is going to break it down. So the little guy on the left, the osteoblast, is building the wall by putting bricks in. The osteoclast is using a pickaxe to break it down. So hopefully you have kind of gotten to the point in this class where you understand that physiology is all about homeostasis. It's all about making sure that things don't get too high and things don't get too low. So we really want to strike a good balance between osteoblast and osteoclast activity. We don't want to throw this balance off. So if you look at the bottom of this diagram, a disease like osteoporosis, which is characterized by a huge loss of a person's bone density over time, you can see what's happening here is that the osteoblasts look pretty normal. They're still doing their job, but the osteoclasts have gotten way, way, way too active. We have shifted the balance in favor of increased osteoclast activity. So instead of using a pickaxe here, the osteoclast is instead opting for a big box of dynamite to blow the whole wall up. So you can imagine the opposite problem, in which the osteoblast becomes too active at the expense of osteoclast. And if that's the case, then the bones are going to become too dense, and the blood and the rest of the body are not going to have a whole lot of calcium and phosphate to use for themselves. So those are things for us to consider here. And then it's also worth mentioning that because osteoclasts are in the hematopoietic lineage, they are actually themselves made in the red marrow. So that's why those osteogenic stem cells only made osteoblasts and not osteoclasts. The osteoclasts come from somewhere else. So within both compact and spongy bone was where we found our red bone marrow, if you will recall, osteocytes are contained within these small little cavities called lacunae. So you can actually see one lacuna right here, these little cavities within this ossified collagen matrix in which they can kind of hide away and become contained within. If we want to have a brief discussion about the blood and nerve supply of a bone, we did say for sure that bone is a very vascularized tissue, so because it is such a hard and dense material, you may be wondering about how the blood vessel and vasculature here works. So blood vessels and nerves actually will enter into the bone through little small openings in the periosteum called nutrient foramina, or foramen if you want to use the singular term. So from there, the vessels will branch into the spongy bone to make sure that we are doing a good job of nourishing the contained osteocytes and other cells found within, because we've already established that these cells have a high energy demand, so they need the oxygen and nutrients that are found within the blood. And then a discussion that we are going to have later in Unit 4 when we talk about the cardiovascular system, but the order of flow here is that the artery will enter into the bone and then branch into capillaries and then into a vein that exits out through a different nutrient foramen. Okay, so very quickly, let's have a little discussion about longitudinal bone growth. So anytime you're talking about the growth of a tissue in the body, this is going to be dependent upon cell division and mitosis of pre-existing cells or stem cells. So we can split the bone here up into a couple of different zones, and the one we want to pay attention to first is called the reserve zone. This reserve zone is going to be the site of new extracellular matrix production, and the cells that are contained within here are called chondrocytes. Chondrocytes are cells that are contained within cartilage tissue, and their main job is to secrete collagen and to form new extracellular matrix. So the lengthening of bone over time before the closing off of the epiphyseal plate is the result, as I said, of the cell division of larger, more mature chondrocytes, and then they are going to spread into a new zone called the proliferative zone, and then finally the zone of maturation and hypertrophy, in which, after the cells have become more numerous, they are going to then grow and get bigger. Eventually, the layer that is closest to the metaphysis, as this layer of chondrocytes expands out over time, these cells will become ossified over time and they will die off and they will just become a part of this new zone of calcified matrix. Basically, the idea here, since I'm providing such a kind of brief and not too terribly detailed description of this, basically chondrocytes secrete matrix, the chondrocytes divide and grow and spread out, and then the chondrocytes die and turn into bone themselves. Bones can also grow in diameter, but by a slightly different mechanism. Not slightly different mechanism, a totally different mechanism. So the thickening of bones is going to be all about that osteoblast and osteoclast remodeling that we talked about. So if a bone is going to grow out over time, you'll want to think about what we discussed about the functions of osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and which one you would want to be more active than the other if you are trying to thicken bone and get it to grow out. A couple of very quick comments about fractures and bone repair. So if you end up working in the healthcare industry, you're going to see plenty of this, I promise you. So when a bone is fractured, this is going to cause tissue damage, and specifically the breaking off of some of those capillaries that are servicing the bone itself. And this is going to cause what's called a fracture hematoma, the result of blood leakage out of those broken capillaries. So the bone cells that are closest to the fracture are going to sense this blood loss, and they are going to begin to die as a result of not getting the blood supply and oxygen that they're used to getting. So the chondrocytes that are contained within the periosteum and endosteum are going to also sense this, and they will form a series of calluses of hyaline cartilage, basically to seal off the injury and to prevent any further loss of blood and to make sure that things don't get leaky and we can restore normal circulation throughout the rest of the healthy bone within. So the osteoclasts, which you'll recall their function is to resorb bone, they will resorb the dead bone, the bone that has died off due to a lack of oxygen, and the hyaline cartilage of the calluses will, as we saw before, will eventually over time be transformed into bone via a process called endochondral ossification, a fairly complicated process that you don't need to worry too much about right now. So the last thing that we'll just say for this video right here is that there is a very strong correlation between the maintenance of bone and what is called mechanical loading. So basically, when you stand up and walk around, you are putting a certain amount of mechanical stress on your bones, and that's actually a very good thing. So the idea here, and you can read more in the hyperlinked article if you want to know more, but the idea here is that regular exercise, which puts this mechanical stress on bone, will actually promote a constant bone remodeling versus, by promoting osteoblast activity versus osteoclast activity. So basically, these osteoblasts, which build up bone, they sense the mechanical loading on the bone, and they will increase their mineral depositing activities as a result. So the picture here you're actually seeing is an astronaut in space. Because of the greatly reduced gravity, astronauts have to maintain a very stringent workout program to make sure that they are putting mechanical stress and loading their bones up. Otherwise, if they just stayed in zero gravity all the time, there would be none of that mechanical loading, and we would lose the balance between osteoblast and osteoclast activity, and they would lose a lot of bone density over time. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. So our next video and the last video in this very short chapter is just going to discuss some of the hormones that we had already discussed, and we're going to look at them more specifically in the context of how they affect both calcium homeostasis and then also the activity of osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So thank you for joining us here, and I will see you next time, all right?